All right, thanks for joining. I am going to be presenting on, as hopefully you already saw, adapting virtual lessons. So I don't know if you saw Mr. Martinez's comment earlier, but he's going to be joining at the end of this to kind of give some other types of practicals for maybe what it would look like to do what I'm suggesting, or just some general tips as well that you can apply elsewhere. So I kind of tried to do a title that would catch some people's attention related to adapting virtual lesson plans for a couple of reasons. Primarily, at least in my mindset last year, I know a lot of us were in survival and we're just trying to get through it and not maybe enjoying virtual teaching. But I think there's still some usefulness in recognizing that our virtual lesson plans from last year, they were a lot of hard work, and primarily, and we don't want to waste that hard work. We want to adapt it if we can. Not saying we will be able to adapt everything, but there are certainly some things we could plan and use to our advantage. Second is, although they might not be the best plans or ways to structure a classroom we've ever done, they're actually probably pretty good. I don't know about you, but my experience is I had to think through my lesson plans last year more than I probably ever have in terms of what exactly should I expect and communicate to students. So, I mean, really compared to any other year, my lesson plans that I, still didn't do in incredible detail, but they were more detailed and more reproducible than I've ever had. Additionally, the model that we did in our virtual time was actually pretty good. Now, some of us may have done some days where they were very brief, and maybe that doesn't exactly work now that we have kids in person. But if we had a lot of virtual students, maybe we did that 30-minute synchronous time. And then the model of the synchronous, asynchronous still works in person, just maybe not thinking about it as synchronous and asynchronous, virtually speaking, but synchronous meaning all class lesson, whether it's lecture or presentations of some sort, and then into students actually applying the learning or the content however best fits for you. And in person gives us a lot more potential with those lesson plans than virtual did. So I'm going to jump back and forth between screens just to see who's here. Cool, we've got a good spectrum. All right, so here is what I mean when I say the model that we had during our virtual lesson plans or our virtual time. So there was the synchronous and asynchronous. And so we can use digital technology to facilitate what I want to call an entire class discussion. And that's kind of where and this can be used for both synchronous and asynchronous portions. One of the issues with our virtual plans that we can build on is actually creating room for a interaction that didn't exist virtually, either in the synchronous or in the asynchronous method. So the way I'm thinking of this, and this is a crude method, but you get the idea. So we have typically some sort of content presented, even if that's just the objective. We should start every class with an objective, so that is something that should be presented. And it could be, how to do a math problem. It could be a certain type of engineering concept or a project and directions. It could be art of some sort where we are communicating the expectations. But then what should follow is some quote unquote discussion of that content. And really what I mean is presenting content is almost pointless if we aren't giving students an opportunity to work at it and to do something with it and really to chew on the material and make sure they understand it, even if that's just the objective. And so we can use digital technology in really all of these ways. Most of us do so with content presentation already, but for discussion of content, we need to have a discussion. But to facilitate that discussion well, we can't have everyone talking at once, but we need everyone communicating at once. We need everyone contributing. And so I'm primarily going to focus on the discussion of content and how we can make that happen. And some ways that I do that. The asynchronous is really more of the check for understanding and further application of maybe our lesson. So essentially, the discussion happens primarily in the synchronous portion. And then the asynchronous is kind of like the work you expect them to do afterwards, the actual task you expect them to perform, whether it's check for understanding as well as an application. So during the content being presented, so you can think of this as during the lesson. I want to talk about how our tools can help us there. So the conversation before and during the lesson is essentially answering a few questions, and we're using tools to answer these questions. Even if you're just presenting your objective, the use of these tools should help us answer, do they hear what we're saying? Like, do they hear me? So today I told my students that we were going to use factor of change method to apply energy and momentum equations. And so we had a discussion about that objective. Now our tools can help us do that. So it's, do they hear the words that I'm saying? Do they hear the factual sounds that I hear? And then secondly, in my communication of that, are they hearing what I want them to hear? Does my objective line up with how they're interpreting it? Or even when I present a concept, I might have thought I said the equation right, or I might have thought I presented the expectations for my project correctly, but are they hearing what I'm saying? And then lastly, do they know what they should from last time? That is sometimes crucial. So I want to show you what that looks like on my lessons, just as an example. I can't find the right screen. Okay, so my lesson from today, I'm literally just borrowing from my lesson today, was energy and momentum factor of change practice. And I began the lesson talking about the objective and then the equations to know. And I wanted to have a conversation with the students to make sure they all knew the equations. I shouldn't have had to reteach this, but you know, probably need to at some point. And so what I did was I used a tool called Pear Deck, most of us know of, and most of us probably hate it, which honestly, if you're not using the inputs of Pear Deck, you really shouldn't be using Pear Deck unless your room is massive in that way, like my room. And so students can see the text on their screen. So I went really quickly, equation by equation, and the students, because of the Pear Deck interface, are able to write the equations in there. So I helped them talk to me about what they should already know. And then we did a during the lesson portion, which was the factor of change method. I talked about it. And then I did examples. And if they're following along, they're able to input the answer. And so if a student didn't input the answer, I know that they probably don't hear me. So using tools like this, another tool that you could use is something called Poll Everywhere. This is kind of like a smaller version of this. This is a free software that you have access to a couple customizable questions. And so what I did, I just said, hey, we need to brainstorm physics facts for this topic. And so students input those physics facts. They can vote on these facts. And this is actually a question from last year. If someone says something that you don't want in the discussion, on your interface, you just exit out and it's gone, and hopefully before no one sees it. And so you can have a class conversation based on what's in here. The things that are liked a lot are probably good things to discuss. And then sometimes not liked things could be helpful to look at. So that's what I mean by facilitating a class discussion. Virtually, it was hard to do this. But now you can add to your lecture little pieces of this in-class discussion. And sure, you could talk about it verbally, but I would be surprised in any given class if more than half of the class is actively engaged in the discussion. By using your tools, you actually get to answer all of these questions, and I'm going to jump back to now, with all of your students, which is the key here. All right. Then, if I'm on the right screen. Awesome. So like I said, Pear Deck and Poll Everywhere are some options. There are other technology options that you could use. Should you have any, I'm also I'm open to learning any if you need help with some you think might be helpful. So that's kind of the discussion during the content presented. But then there's the discussion of the content in terms of the actual chewing on that content as you're kind of wrapping up the lesson. So the conversation afterward should help us answer, are they making connections, or are they able to make more connections? In my class, I think about it as facts, understanding, and then application. So after the lesson, I expect them to be past the facts. I expect them to know the facts because I've been kind of checking to make sure they hear me as we go. And so now they should be able to understand and therefore make connections. At least trying to make connections. And then are they making the correct connections? And then lastly, are they ready to actually apply what we're talking about? And this one is where we have tons of tools. These are less for direct conversation, but rather they help you know who you need to have more discussion with or reteach. Khan Academy and quizzes are ones that I use all the time because although I can't see the question they're on in that moment, when they finish it, I can see individually as well as for the whole class what needs help. Kahoot and Quizlet are other ones. Quizlet I like a lot for certain scenarios. AP Classroom and OnTrack are kind of ones we might go to use because of, data-driven instruction purposes. However, I want to point out that you don't need to have an intense, even graded check for understanding or discussion every day. So I never grade my Pear Decks because it doesn't really matter if I give them a grade. I can still tell from the Pear Deck that they're learning it, and therefore they'll have a higher grade come the actual check for understanding or the further discussion that we have, whatever that looks like. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of turning the synchronous time and as well as dipping into the post-synchronous time for understanding, thinking of them as conversations where you need everyone engaged, but not necessarily everyone talking. And you can use that to your advantage, or you can use the technology to your advantage. Here are some tips I want to end with. A class may involve all or just parts of this format. So today my class was primarily application, but the Pear Deck was used as a quick type of discussion. Because of the discussion, you might have to be flexible and adaptable as to what you expect to talk about exactly. You might need to come up with a new problem, or you might need to ask some different questions in order to check for understanding. The check for understanding and the continued conversation pieces could always be given for homework if you want to structure it that way. I already mentioned this, but you don't need to grade everything. And then my last tip, which connects back to the technology, is you should do whatever is easier for you. And I know technology might be harder for some of us, but using the technology to get all of that conversation in one place, and then with a little bit of training, you have the skills to lead that conversation from there, can be quite beneficial. So that is it for my part of the presentation. Now Mr. Martinez is going to take over.
Hello. Well, good for me. I don't actually have to add much to that because you covered most everything. And really, I just get to ride Mr. Gary's coattails today. But I do have a few tips that I would throw out there. The tips that I have are mostly for new teachers. Let me share my screen and get my PowerPoint up there. Uh-oh, I did not do the thing. There it goes. Seems like I got a red box and I'm sharing now. If anybody's having any trouble seeing it, let me know. Otherwise, I'll assume you can see it. It's kind of slow.
Miss Confletti, I ran the participant list already.
There we go. Excellent. So this is mostly for new teachers, but maybe some veteran teachers out there might have a couple things they could glean from it. But it's really just ways to integrate what Mr. Gary was talking about, making it easy on yourself. Let me just jump right in. Working with groups and individuals. So what I was thinking about when Mr. Gary was talking that I hadn't thought of before was, yes, some of us struggle with this technology, but if you can front load the technology, get past that little hurdle, then it opens up all kinds of freedom and possibilities. For example, like he was saying with flexibility, if you have a large class, you can work in groups, you can work in individuals with the software. You can move back and forth from groups to individuals very easily with this software. You can consider giving people a choice to work in groups or work solo. This has happened to me a couple of times already this year, where I'll ask people to break into groups of 3 or 4, and I'll notice that one kid is still working solo and trying to get away with it. And my first thought is, how dare you defy me and not get into a group? But then I take a breath and say, you know what? For this one today, let's just see how it goes. Maybe you working on your own is the way you want to do this one today. I won't let you do it every time, but today let's see how it goes. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Some groups it works better, some assignments it works better, something to consider. Something Mr. Gary and I talked about before this was when it comes to making your groups, that can sometimes be a challenge. One way to do it might be that if we're going to work with 4 pieces of software today, which one do you want to work with? And they don't know yet that they're going to be put into groups until they've chosen the software. You choose the software first, and then that determines which group you end up working with. Just an idea. This is something I don't always do, but every time I do it, it works much better, which is to include group roles. If there's 4 people in a group, each member has a specific role that they're supposed to play. The roles change depending on what your task is. But I found it really helps classroom management because they spend a lot less time arguing and yelling at each other or even talking to other groups because they have one specific thing that they're assigned to do with their group. Sometimes I choose the group, usually I choose the group, but occasionally it's nice to let them choose amongst themselves. I have never really found that it causes tension to have them choose. They usually just get through it because they just want to get it over with. Sometimes people have very strong feelings and you have to step in and referee. And on a rare occasion with really advanced groups and the right task, I don't actually choose any specific role for a specific person, but let them know that before this task is done, each of these 4 roles must have been met, and then see how they choose to do it. Maybe they choose to divide it up equally, or maybe they choose to grab onto the thing that works best for them, but they don't end up actually assigning themselves the role so much as making sure all the roles get completed. There's a lot of trial and error in this, and you use your best judgment because you know which groups can get away with certain things and which groups don't deserve freedom. Monitoring, I sometimes fall into the bad habit, not anymore, but I used to, of when group work is happening, I don't have to go out there and monitor, I can do something else. But in fact, every time I do get up and move around to monitor, I realize, oh my God, they're off task, or more likely, here this last while, I've noticed they're not off task, but that they are struggling and they don't want to speak up. And so I find myself going and doing a lot of troubleshooting. And so, of course, you always want to monitor for content mastery, but I also remind students once in a while, you're learning 2 things when you're in a group. You're learning whatever the content is. You're also learning how to work with a group. And that's a skill. We sometimes forget that that's actually a valuable skill that takes practice, and it takes working with different groups of people and realizing that you don't work well with everyone, and why don't you work well with everyone, and how can we actively try to work better with certain people, and that only comes with practice. And so I try never to forget that I'm always doing two things at the same time, teaching one content and teaching group work. So teaching from bell to bell can sometimes be a problem, and with what Mr. Gary's laid out for us today, that should never be a problem if you're using all this software, because there's way more than you could ever do in 90 minutes. So you always have an easy way to move on to something else. You could assign what the student must move on to after they've completed whatever they've completed. If they completed early, they can move on to the next thing, or you could let them choose what they move on to. And another feature I think was mentioned, but I'll say it again, is that you don't have to have everybody on the software. The software can be working in groups, and you can be pulling up people to work one-on-one with you on something analog, to do a quick assessment, to bring a group of people up whom you know need extra help, and you can work on them individually while the other groups are working over there. And then the final takeaway is to just saying that reimagining how you use your asynchronous time allows you to be flexible in your grouping and your instruction and your pacing, and it will help you teach from bell to bell. Hopefully some of this was useful to you. Thank you very much for your time. That's all I have. Let me unshare my screen.
Thank you so much, Mr. and Mr. Martinez. I'm echoing. Thank you both so much. I think that, you know, it's really good thing that we have career pathways this year, because it allows us these opportunities to be able to share the great things that we're doing. Even though most of us on the call are seasoned teachers, we can still benefit from hearing new things and trying new things. So also what I would challenge our visitors with, our other teachers on the call, is if you're doing something that has really been working well for you, we could all benefit from that. So if you wanted to put something together to present on days like this, it can be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, whatever you feel is appropriate to relay the information. This is a learning community after all, so we could, especially being kind of out of the building and out of our daily routines with teaching for a year and a half, we could all benefit from refreshers. So Ms. Rodenberger has a question. She says, I like the idea of group member tasks, but struggle to think of tasks that meet the needs. Can you provide task options that you use in your class?
I can provide a couple while Mr. Gary's thinking over there and clarifying, referring to group role. I think you're referring to group roles, Ms. Rodenberger, I assumed. Yes. So in my English class, they might be a group of 4 people, one of whom might be assigned to only look for literary devices within the task. Another person would be assigned to pull quotes and insert quotes into an answer for the task. Another person might be assigned to come up with commentary for the group to discuss and then share out. So I just take whatever the components of the individual task would be. If one person were going to have to do a rhetorical analysis assignment, and then it has 5 components, give each person only one of the components, and then that encourages them to talk about it. And then, of course, I often, if not always, have them after it's over share out. And when they share out, each person gets their chance to speak and share their individual role. I'm not sure what that would look like in other disciplines, but it's the basic concept of breaking it down into components, and each person gets one component.
I'll add something to that. Something we discussed, Mr. Martinez and I, was that you don't necessarily need every student to have a very specific role every single time. My favorite role to give, and it's probably the main role that I give, is it's essentially the person in the group that's allowed to talk to me. Which is kind of a little unorthodox, but the reason is I need them to have the discussion amongst themselves. And so I like to force them, a particular student, I might say, hey, the oldest student in the group is allowed to talk to me. And so they might have a question, and reasonably so. And then you could always say, okay, now this person is the next person who's allowed to talk to me. So almost like you can move the roles around. If you only have 2 roles, that's fine. but you can maybe say, hey, switch roles. So you could have one person who's referring to a textbook, one person who's got their calculator, one person has their notes, one person's writing the group's answers, and then just randomly yell switch and kind of switch roles if you needed to. Even if you only had like 2 or 3 roles, you could do that.
Any other questions? All righty, so we have this recorded. I'm going to upload both of y'all's PDs into a playlist on our YouTube channel, and then I will send that link on Friday. Thank you so much, and thank you all for attending. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.